Hey, what's going on, DDO players? Axel here. So, today we're going to talk about a huge, gigantic, enormous change that was made to the game. Like one of the biggest changes in a long time. Like it's going to flip the meta for melees like on its head, essentially, because it's just a massive buff for melees. So, we're going to go through it and we're going to talk about all of the developer comments, and then we're going to get really deep into some of the effects I think this might have on the meta for melees and for Reaper and just the game in general. So again, this is a massive change and there's so much to say. So this is going to be a very long video. So if you need to go get a comfortable chair or you need to go get a drink or something, just pause the video and go do that because we're going to be here a while. Okay. All right, let's start by going through the developer, some of the not all the developer posts on this subject because they recently opened up a kind of a feedback request thread or a changes thread on the forums, which I'll link to in the description. But let's go over some of the what I think are the more relevant comments by the developers, and we're going to go over the initial posting of this change, of course. So here we go. So melee survivability changes, some first steps. So that means first steps. This is obviously the first in a multi-step process. They did mention that this is just one change, and they might do more or do less or adjust it. And all these changes I'm going to announce. These are not announced, but discuss. They've said that these are not final, so they could change. They could potentially, I think with this change, I doubt they'll make it any more of a buff, but they could potentially scale it back a little bit before it goes live. But from the developers, from what I've seen in the past, I think there's a really small chance that this doesn't hit live servers at this point, because usually when they make a big like announcements or game change like this, they don't completely like scrap it. It might go in slightly reduced, but I think this is going to go into the game. Like very, very high chance this goes into the game. So, all right. So let's go ahead and get started. So in the upcoming patch, the developers are saying they will be introducing a few changes to give a boost to melee build survivability, particularly in the epic range. Because of the variety of builds and playstyles, this will be a multi-step process that will involve adding some features which will be generally available to anyone, and changes that target specific classes or builds, such as the barbarian changes listed below. And yes, there are some specific barbarian changes listed as part of this post, but I'm not going to go over those. But if you're a barbarian or you run a barbarian, definitely check out the thread and read through those, because I'm not going to go through them. Just because it's going to make a long video even longer, and it's only specific to certain barbarian builds. So just read that if you run a barbarian. But anyways, so this is the big change. It's a new feat called Epic Defensive Fighting. Your hero has learned to enter a reactive state, protecting themselves in the chaos of battle by rolling with the punches, but this hampers their ability to engage ranged threats. And yes, it's a new epic feat and is auto-granted at level 21. So it's not going to take up an epic feat slot, anything like that. And it is a toggle. And this is what it does. While the toggle is active, you get a 10% competence bonus to max hit points, with an additional 10% for every combat fighting style feat you have, up to a maximum of 50%. Yes, 50% HP boost to all melee characters that have at least 5 combat feats that we'll go over in a second, but 50% boost to all melees. Yes, I'm not making that up. That's what they're doing. 50% HP boost to all melees. Minus if it's going to be a competence bonus, so it doesn't stack with some things we'll go over in a minute. But 50% boost. That's gigantic. Okay, in addition to that, of course, they're not going to give this to every character, so there are some restrictions. Okay, all spell or spell-like abilities that you have that are affected by meta magics have their range reduced to touch range while you're using this. So obviously, this is not an ability that's meant to be used by casters or ranged characters. It's supposed to only be a buff to melees. So any spell or ranged ability, so you shoot a bow, your throwers, any kind of offensive spellcaster, and this also unfortunately includes healing and buffing apparently. So anything that's affected by meta magics is going to be have its range reduced to touch. So that even stuff like raising dead, I would assume, because that's affected by quicken. So anything like that, it basically loses all of its range, and this feat also reduces your double shot and range power to 0 while active. So your range, you can't use this if you're going to be an archer or thrower, because obviously your range power is going to be completely handicapped. So this again is a buff meant for melees only. This is exclusive from ranged stances like improved precise shot, archer's focus, Shirati stances, warlock blast stances. So you can't have both at once. So again, this is not meant to be used by casters or ranged. And this is exclusive from the enlarged spell metamagic toggle. It remains active while you're dead, and it can be used with other offensive and defensive stances and rage. And that it's referring to stances like Stalwart Defender stance or Sacred Defender stance, which we'll get into a minute, because I think that's one of the more controversial areas of this change. Okay, so next let's list here listed here is the complete list of fighting feats that apply. So if you have each of these that you have on your character, will give you a 10% competence bonus to your character's HP up to a maximum of 5. And so I think most builds are going to have, if you're a single weapon fighting or two-handed fighting, you're going to have the 4 here. So like two-handed fighting, for example, if you have two-handed fighting, improved, greater, and perfect two-handed fighting, and then maybe you take 2 weapon fighting for the double strike or something, that's going to be your 5. So that's going to count. Natural fighting also counts. So that's how it's going to work. Okay, in addition, Paladin defensive stance HP buff will be changed to competency, which it always has, but the text was incorrect. And I actually wasn't aware of this because this was a bug, which I should have been. I don't know how I missed it because I use it. But the Sacred Defender stance for Paladins has been listed in the game right now. It's listed, and on the wiki it's listed as a sacred type bonus, but it's going to be changed to competency so that it's not going to stack with this, so that it doesn't stack. And we'll talk more about all the tanky builds and how this might upset some of those players a little bit because they're not going to benefit as much as your straight melee DPS characters. Asmar racial HP bonus will be changed to sacreds, so that will stack. Okay, so that's the core of the announcement. And let's get into some of the clarifications by the developers. Here's one post that says, this is deliberately meant to not be attractive to ranged and spellcaster characters, which I've already said that. We wouldn't want anything like this adjustment to help non-hand-to-hand melee-focused characters. This is by design. This is deliberately only a buff to melee characters, not people who sometimes melee who cast spells predominantly or who are range-focused. They are not in need of a change like this, and I'll talk about why that is in a second. After I get through these dev comments. Okay, this isn't necessarily intended to be always on. It's a situational boost to melee builds who need a bit of help when going toe to toe with some enemies. So say you want to do a little bit of casting and a little bit of melee, or a little bit of melee, a little bit of healing, you can toggle this on or off. I don't think that's very practical, and I'll get into that in a minute. Next comment. This is not meant to be on during situations when a spellcasting melee would be casting spells on other players. So if you need to heal other players, you shouldn't be using this. Oh, that kind of sucks. If you are spot healing or buffing, this isn't for you. One of the reasons we are considering this change is to address the community's concern that melee are not able to compete in more difficult content with their spellcasting and range using friends. If there is a larger belief that this is not the case, we'd love to hear that. And again, there's so much to talk about. I'll get to that in a minute. Like, I have so many things to say, on this topic as soon as I get through these comments. Okay, here's another dev comment. Someone asked what was the impetus for this change. The developer responded, it was several things, such as we have periodically seen traffic on the forums from melee players complaining they are having trouble surviving. Folks often posted counters to this, stating this could be overcome. As we watch players play the game, we've noticed melee DPS was underrepresented on high difficulty. Not gone entirely, but noticeably more uncommon. I'm talking mostly about raids or Reaper 6+ skulls. So this change is, I have so much to say on this, but yeah, it's really focused on helping out players in Reaper difficulty. Okay, when the team would run play days on Elite in Reaper, we would often experience some of what the forums seem to be talking about. Random deaths on our melee DPS due to stray shots, even when the tank was on top of aggro. While better builds help, it took noticeably more work than, say, a ranged DPS build. Okay, some more dev comments. This change, Epic Defense, that's the name of the feat, again, is really about the relationship of ranged and melee DPS in DDO. Yeah, that's like the main reason this is being changed. Okay, and how it works out in our higher difficulties. Our current thread of logic goes something like this. So melee physically dodge less attacks than ranged. So the devs are saying, to be clear, I mean avoiding the mob's swing, detect, or projectile outright, or no hit roll at all. Not even talking about the static defenses, less distance to threat equals less time to react. We realize some players are exceptionally good at doing this in melee, but it's much harder. So yes, so ranged doesn't have to deal with as many hits as melee does, essentially is what the dev's saying there. Okay, the other question, why aren't they just lowering monster damage? And the devs have said the thing is, to challenge a melee character and a ranged character equally, you really need a different ratio of hits to kill. Our ranged characters, kiters, can be really hard to catch, so killing them in something like only 2 or 3 hits is probably about right for a higher difficulty. But for melee, getting tagged 3 times in close succession is much more likely unavoidable. We want to support really hard difficulty, but it's hard to do with these two groups being too similar in toughness. So they're saying that yes, the thing they're really trying to work on here and really trying to fix is the effective toughness of melees. So yes, melees right now in the game, they have access to more abilities to help them be tougher mathematically. Yes, they can take more hits, but when you look at a practical situation, ranged are avoiding much more hits. So melee may need to be able to take even more hits than they currently can. Okay, next, Dev said, don't melee have tools to solve this already? Yes, they have the tools, but 1, the best ones require a shield or heavy armor, so that leaves some folks out. 2, many of these tools are generally available, and we need a durability difference in the 2 playstyles, or the monster damage is going to be wrong for someone. It's why this feat has so many odd rules to it. Okay, next, but melee does more damage, and the dev says technically, but the opportunity cost is a thing, and many ranged builds have really good burst DPS via mini shot or Fear of the Wild, so unless the fight goes really long, the melee often don't have a significant DPS lead. Okay, one more group of one more chunk of dev comments here, and then I'll get into my thoughts. Okay, next, I thought it was important to read all these because it really kind of sets the stage for what I'm about to say. Okay, isn't 50% too extreme? It really depends on the difficulty you play on. We could see this buff going down to 30%. So again, like I said, they might possible they could reduce it to 30%. 30%, making it a cheap alternative to the defensive stances, but when you look at 7+ skulls, it's probably only buying you a couple of hits. It will make things easier, but in our view, it means certain builds will play on higher difficulties more than, say, some other builds which are already up there. So yeah, so what the dev's saying there is 50% seems like a lot, but it's really not on the super high skulls, on the nosebleed difficulties, which I don't play, but some people do, and 50% HP might seem like a lot, but it's really only a tiny little bit more, a few seconds of staying alive. Okay, next, Dev said, why HP? A couple of reasons. 1, HP works on every damage type. 2, it pushes healing, gearing trees to be more useful, and that's the other thing that's big right there is you're going to have to gear more to heal now. It used to be you could heal inherently. You didn't have to put too much investment on it. If you were a cleric, you could just take Radiant Servant. You could take the Radiant Servant bonuses in Tree and just put a devotion item on and be good. Not really anymore, and that's kind of gone in this direction for a while now as HP amounts has gone higher. But with a 50% increase to melees, you're going to actually have to start putting more healing gear on to heal as a cleric. You have to gear more, and it seems like that's something that they're doing on purpose. Okay, back to the dev comment. 3, HP is being done because in a lump sum here, it'd be really hard to do it as PRR, MRR, which is better delivered piecemeal because it's more effective at lower values. Next comment. by the devs. And this is another big one in this whole discussion. Very complex discussion. This will make things too easy. The dev says yes, but hopefully in a way that lets us make it harder in a more balanced way going forward. Epic defense is really about creating a toughness difference between melee and range so we can challenge them correctly. So that's the thing I'll get to in a minute, is that one of the bad side effects of this is going to make content that's already too easy even easier. So stuff like normal difficulty, which is already like really, really, really easy, it's going to make it even more easy, and it's going to make hard and elite even easier, whereas I don't think those difficulties really need to be made easier. Okay, next, Dev says don't panic. Buff panic, is that a thing? In case it is, we are still in the feedback phase, and this will be on Lamania, and all level 21 plus characters will find it in their feats list on the preview server. I hope many people try it out and see where it puts their melee builds against the current difficulty settings. Okay, a few clarifications. Epic defense won't affect the range of point blank AoEs centered on the caster. It will affect cones. So stuff like, I assume that means that stuff like Radiant Servant Burst and Aura will not be affected for clerics, so that's good. Good for me, although this is still kind of bad for me. It will affect overall. Okay, it will affect cones, so it will affect, sounds like it will affect, say, like the cones for the new favored soul Beacon of Hope tree. So if you want to melee and use beacons on your favorite soul, it sounds like you can't do that unless you're going to toggle the thing on and off. Okay, this stacks with other HP sources that are not competence typed. So while you can still run a defensive stance like Stalwart, you don't get both HP bonuses, just the highest. Okay, with that done, let's go ahead and get into my comments because I have a lot of them. So it goes without saying, this is a massive change. And I want to emphasize again, this is not final. It's still being considered. So there's a chance it could be toned down or not implemented. Although, again, as I've said earlier in this video, the chances of it not being implemented seem to me, based on the devs' prior history of proposing things like this, seems to be quite low. So the chances of it being in the game are going to be very good. Okay, and I see what they're doing with this change. This is being done because mobs hit so hard in Reaper that they want melees to stay alive longer, so that up-close builds are viable and not just ranged builds. The thing you have to understand about ranged and casters versus melees and DDO is that ranged casters for a long time have had inherently more survivability just because of the way the game works, in the way how much more risk melees have to endure when they have damage. Like when you're on a melee and you want to kill a monster, you have to run up to the monster and let it hit you while you hit it, essentially. Whereas ranged and archer type characters, thrower type characters can do it from a safe distance and not put themselves in danger. So while casters in ranged inherently don't have some of the bonuses that melee characters do, their effective survivability is much higher, and that's what they're trying to address here. In any kind of fantasy lore type game like this, casters and rangers are supposed to be more fragile than melees. It's how the game's supposed to work, because if melees are not more fragile than ranged and casters, there's not much of a reason to play a melee, because casters normally, in DDO and in most types of games, are just safer because they can attack from a distance, and they usually have a lot bigger variety of tools. So that's what they're trying to address. So as weird as it sounds, this is actually not intended to be a buff for melees as much as it is intended to be a feat that's supposed to kind of close that distance between the effective survivability of casters and melee. So, what the devs have said here and what a lot of people have said, and I don't know, because from my personal experiences, I don't play the high Reapers, but from what the devs are saying here is that really range and casters are overrepresented, and with the way Reaper works with mobs hitting so hard, the way to beat Reaper right now is to play really safe characters like ranged and throwers and things that don't have to deal with potentially getting killed by a mob by getting too close. Basically, the way to beat it is to kite and stay away, and that's what they're trying to address. They think that melees should be able to stay in their preferred playstyle while playing Reaper. Okay. A better solution, I think, to this problem, but this would never happen. But I think the better solution, which wouldn't involve all the power creep that this is going to happen, and I'm not saying that I want this. I want this to be a change to happen instead of what they're doing. I'm just saying that if the developer's goal is to shrink this distance, the better way to do that, just on a silver, just on a in a spreadsheet or not a spreadsheet, but just in a void, the best way to do this would not be to massively buff melees. It would be to nerf casters. And again, I'm not saying I want casters nerfed or anything like that. I'm just saying if their intention is to shrink that gap, it would be better to nerf casters. If we're in a situation where no one was going to get mad, it would be better to nerf casters than buff melees, because the problem with buffing and putting all this power creep in is it's going to invalidate a lot of content, invalidate gear, whereas if you just did some nerfs instead, it wouldn't make like different layers of content too easy. It wouldn't make different gear outdated and not as relevant, anything like that. So that would be the better way to go about it if that's what the developers want to do. Again, I'm not saying I want them to do that. I'm just saying if that's their intention, it seems like that would be a better way to do it. But obviously that's not going to happen. And I don't blame the developers for not doing that, because players obviously would riot. If they came in tomorrow and said, okay, we're going to cut caster HP and MRR and PRR by this amount and this amount and this amount, players would mass on sub, and they can't do that because players hate nerfs. And I totally understand. Nerfs are freaking terrible. They suck, even though they are needed sometimes. I mean, players got really mad after a lot of little nerfs they've done. Players have kind of blown up, but imagine a huge nerf like that. Players would really, really get upset, and it's not something developers want to do. So I understand why that's not an option. So that's why we're going by the way of power creep to solve this problem. And it's sad that we have to do it that way, but it's understandable that has to be the solution if they want to fix this problem. Okay, this change seems to be aimed at the game population that's running Epic Elite and low Reapers. And that's the area of the game that is going to be affected by far the most by this. Like the players, actually like me, who tend to run, like I typically run stuff like Epic Elite and Reaper 1. I don't really go much higher than that. And that's that's the range of players that's going to be the most affected by this. This is not going to affect as much your players who are running like Reaper 7, 8, 9, 10, because as I mentioned earlier, the 50% HP buff doesn't mean nearly as much, because the additional hits you can survive from a 50% HP buff on those really high difficulties is not near as much as in like Epic Elite or Reaper 1. Like a 50% HP buff in Epic Elite means you survive way more hits than you would, way more additional hits than you would in like Reaper 10. So this is really what it's seen to be aimed at, and this change is going to help prop up your Epic Elite type players and doing more Reaper stuff. And it is, again, as I said before, this is a balance around Reaper, which we'll get into into another discussion here in a minute about whether they should be balancing around Reaper, which is kind of one of the concerns I had months ago when I made that was Reaper a success video. One of my main concern going forward is, are they going to start balancing the game around Reaper? Are they going to start making Reaper the default difficulty? So we'll get into that in a minute. Okay. So let's go ahead and go through some of the classes and groups of characters who this helps, and some of the groups of characters who it hurts. So there's really one main group of characters that it helps. So your DPS melees. So your Kensei type builds, your Knights of the Chalice paladins, or characters that aren't really using a defensive stance, that are offensive melees. They all become much more viable, especially in Reaper, obviously, because their HP is going to be massively buffed, and there's no opportunity cost. They're not going to, they're not going to lose out on anything. It's just a strict buff to them, and that's the main group that it helps, and the biggest group that it helps. Any kind of DPS melee, not your tank melees. We'll talk about that in a second. So here's the groups that it hurts by proxy, and when I say by proxy, I don't mean that it's a nerf. It's not a nerf, but it it means that all the other builds in the game will catch up to these, the other builds in the game will catch up to these characters as a result. So the advantage these characters might have had, or the disadvantage, the advantages these types of characters might have had will shrink, or the disadvantage comparatively to other classes in the meta, if they were at a disadvantage, will grow if they don't get this buff. So by proxy, it hurts obviously casters and range focused builds, obviously, and this is by design. And it seems like on the forums there's been a lot of upset caster range players who are understandably kind of jealous because their characters are not getting this buff, and they're not really happy about it. And it's understandable, but it's I think when you get to a lot of caster builds and range builds, they're fine. But I can understand why you'd be frustrated if a lot of builds are, your friends' builds are getting this massive buff and you aren't, because you're kind of so used to being really ahead of them, and now they're going to catch up a lot. So, or even if you're not ahead of them, maybe you run a caster build that's, say, like an Archmage Wizard or something, and you're not one of the best caster builds, and now that now you're going to be behind even more with certain characters. So that sucks. But again, it's unfortunately there's going to be classes like that, like your Wizard Archmage, that are going to be hit by collateral damage with this change, because there's no way to buff those type of characters and not also buff your what are seen as your strongest caster, strongest range characters in the game. So that's fine. I think that obviously that's fine. They can't give this to casters or ranged. Obviously, if they did, they wouldn't implement this in the first place. So that's fine. So another thing about it being a nerf or not, it's not a nerf. It's more of a nerf by proxy, which is the way I call it. But some people would argue that it's not a nerf at all because you don't have to worry about it. It's not going to affect you. But keeping up in the meta, while not, it's not important. I made a video on this a while back called I think I called it "Keeping Up with the Meta." Should you keep up with the meta? It's not important that you play the most powerful build in the game, but it is important that you play a build that's viable. So I think that with some builds, my build, unfortunately, this may push a build that was borderline viable into the now not viable in Reaper, especially if the population of the game starts to move up to running like Reaper 2 or 3 as standard in a public group. Builds that can't handle that are going to have to either play with a static group or solo or change their build. So that's worth noting. So, okay, the next group of classes that this is going to hurt by proxy is your tank builds. Because yes, tank builds like Stalwart Defenders and Sacred Defenders do get this buff, but it doesn't stack with their defensive stance. So they're going to get a smaller buff. So they're going to lose that advantage they had when it comes to building a tank. So the thing with tank builds in DDO, and the stupid flea won't stop flying in my face. Okay, the thing with tank builds in DDO is a lot of them have built up they've really focused their build on making it have the highest HP as possible, having the best defense as possible, and they give up a lot with that. So what's going to happen with this change is all the stances, like, again, Stalwart Defender stance, defensive Sacred Defender stance, Druid's nature stance for defensive stance are all competence bonuses, so they're not going to stack on top of this. So that means that there's really no point in taking those stances if you're also going to have 5 combat feats to get a competence bonus HP from these. Now, it is worth noting that the stances obviously have benefits that aren't just HP, like saves bonuses, things like that, and MOR, PRR bonuses, things like that. But it's just the overall attractiveness of the stances is now reduced. And the HP advantage that tanks have over DPS, melees, that difference is now shrunk. So in comparison to DPS melee builds, tank builds now have less of an HP advantage in comparison. So that makes the overall attractiveness of tank builds, it lessens it. So they'll see less of a boost. Now, there is a small compromise with this, is that tanks can now spend action points they were spending in this competence HP boost on something else if they are taking enough feats to get the bonus. But that obviously doesn't make up for it. And I'm not sure that a lot of tank builds were taking enough offensive feats to really benefit from it anyways. But the thing with the tank builds is obviously you can still take these defensive stances and it doesn't directly affect them. It's more of a by proxy effect. But why would you spend HP on competence HP bonuses when you can just get more HP with no action point costs and get better DPS on top of that by just taking offensive feats instead and benefiting from this new toggle? It's a disadvantage that tanking builds have to spend action points on HP bonuses. It's a disadvantage that tanking builds have to spend HP on HP bonuses that non-tanks get for free. So if you're not taking, say you're building a tank build and you're not planning on taking your 5 combat feats to get your plus 15% or even 4 to get plus 40% HP bonus from this new toggle, it's a disadvantage that taking builds are going to have to spend action points in their defensive stances to get these competence bonuses that all the melee DPS melees are getting for free. So there's a huge opportunity cost lost there. So the defensive stances for these type of characters just becomes much less attractive in comparison, and tanks in general become much less attractive. And I wouldn't say that those builds were exactly overpowered. And this is probably my first big disagreement with this change. It seems to me like it should stack with these tanking bonuses. That this toggle shouldn't be a competence bonus. It should just stack with all of these defensive bonuses as well. And I thought a lot about that, but I don't really see a reason why the devs feel like they need to shrink the advantage that tanking builds have over melee builds in terms of HP. Now, maybe they feel like if they give tanking builds this benefit as well, the HP totals will just be so ridiculous. But the thing is, as we'll get into in a minute, they really should be increasing the mob DPS in Reaper to balance this out. And again, you might think that, why are they doing that? Why would Axel? Why would they do that? Why would they increase the mob DPS at the same time as increase the HP? Isn't that canceling out the effect? And the answer is no. Well, the answer is yes, it is for the melee characters, but it's by proxy nerfing the caster and range builds that this change is really aimed at, is by reducing that gap. Because as I stated before, the impetus or the point of this change is not to buff melees per se, it's to shrink that gap between casters and melee in terms of effective survivability. So if they give this HP bonus to all melees and increase the mob DPS to match it, that doesn't really matter, because that will still reduce that effective toughness between casters and melees. So it's going to make things harder for casters and ranger. I don't know if it's going to make it harder, but it's more like that it's going to make them have to be more careful, and it's going to let melees keep their same relative level of toughness as they have now. So it's effectively going to be a by proxy reduction to the toughness of casters range. So and we'll get more into Reaper in a minute. Like, I'm not even close to being done with this video. There's so much to say. Okay. So when it comes to the tanking builds, it seems like the main draw of making a tanking character is now threat gen saves PRR boost. If this goes through without a modification, and assuming this goes live without it stacking with defensive stances. All right. Let's talk next about the next group of classes, the saddest part of the video. Let me just drink some water before I get into this. Oops. All right. The saddest part of the video, the builds that are going to be hurt, not directly hurt by this, but again, hurt by proxy because they're not receiving a big buff that other classes are, and that's hybrid builds, such as melee clerics, as in the build I like to run, the build that I've run for like 10 years in this game, that I may have to reassess now. Because the thing is, well, thankfully they did say that things like Radiant Servant Aura and Burst can be used. It sounds like their range won't be affected while this toggle is active. Any build like, say, a melee divine, melee cleric, melee favorite soul, eldritch knight, those builds are hurt by this, or not hurt again, not nerfed or anything like that, but it's just they're going to be left behind because they're not receiving this bonus that all the other melees are. And these are the type of builds that were already behind in the meta, and they're going to be left even further behind in the meta, which really sucks. Because the way this toggle works is you can't cast spells or raise people or anything like that, as well as have this toggle on. So that seems to go against the very design intent of these trees, like Eldritch Knight and War Priest and War Soul. Yes, you can toggle on and off, but it really discourages you from running a hybrid build. And I really have serious questions about how viable hybrid builds like this are anymore, because they were already, like, these types of builds I mentioned, Eldritch Knight, War Soul, War Priest, were already like on the fringes of viability, in my opinion, when it comes to Reapers. And now it's like, now you can get this effect, but you can't use the main point of running the build, which is doing multiple things at the same time, like doing a little bit of casting there, a little bit of melee here. You can't really do that anymore. You're kind of locked into one thing, and it's going to be a huge headache. And again, you can play these type of builds apparently and just toggle the thing on and off, but it's a huge, it's a big headache, and it's a big discouragement to actually playing that type of play style, because now you can't just play the type of play style you want in this way. You have to constantly toggle the thing on and off. So I don't like that, and I've thought about this a lot over the past day or two. I mean, not a lot. I have a life. I'm not just obsessed with DDO, but I've thought about this a bit. Like, am I being biased here? Because again, this is the build I run. I thought about it. I'm like, no, I'm not, because I don't really see the point of kind of taking out these type of builds as collateral damage. Why don't they just put some kind of ability, if it maybe included as part of these trees, like War Soul, War Priest, Eldritch Knight, some ability that lets them benefit from this feat as well as cast at the same time. I don't think we have to worry about these type of builds being overpowered in this way, because obviously these trees I've mentioned are not the most powerful ones in the game by any chance, and when it goes forward with balancing, they can balance them with that in mind. But I do think that, like, melee clerics should be able to cast the heal spell and raise people and cast a mass cure while they're meleeing, and it just sucks that you can't really do that now unless you want to put up with the headache of constantly having to toggle the thing on and off. And who knows how that'll work? I mean, maybe it has a cooldown, I don't know, but that'll make it even less viable. So it sounds to me like these type of builds are going to be really hurt by this change by proxy. Again, not indirectly nerfed, because this is just a buff, but when it comes to their relative place in the meta, that is going to be hurt, because they're going to be left behind all more melee builds. It's like, it sucks, and I don't really see the point of hurting these builds. I think this is my second big disagreement, in addition to the tanking thing not stacking, is I think that they should include something for these type of builds. Maybe put it in like tier 4 War Priest or tier 4 Eldritch Knight tree, tier 4 War Soul or something. Put an ability in there that lets them heal. Obviously, I think it's fine if they don't want to allow these type of builds to do offensive casting, of course, and benefit from this feat. But at least let them heal and buff while they're doing melee. And then when it comes to your War Soul, War Priest, and maybe Eldritch Knights, let them do some offensive casting in addition to melee, because that's kind of the whole point of an Eldritch Knight build, as far as I understand. Haven't run one, but that's the arcane / melee tree. So let them do both maybe, and you can balance that out by keeping that tree not nearly as powerful in melee or casting as comparison to other trees, which I think is the case right now. Like, I know Eldritch Knight's one of the weaker trees in the game, so maybe when they get around to that balance pass, just don't buff them as much. Okay, let's move on to spot healing, because a thing in Reaper is that even if you're not a divine or whatever, a lot of players, like paladins too, are affected by this, like to do some spot healing here or there, and you can't really do that anymore because of the range penalty. So if you're a paladin or something and you cast a cure spell every once in a while or whatever, you can't do that anymore. This change locks you more into doing one thing in DDO rather than doing a variety of things. So this kind of pushes us back, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, because I've often in the past said that I think DDO went too far with this in years past with homogenizing builds and things, and this pushes us back into the defining characters more as roles, having a role being, you're a melee, or you're a divine, or you're a caster. It's not so much as doing multiple things. So the thing in Reapers especially is I know a lot of characters that are not divines will constantly spot heal each other as a way of helping each other stay alive in Reaper, because in Reaper self-healing is nerfed, but healing other party members is not. That's not going to really be a thing anymore. If you have this toggle on, you can't do that really. I mean, you can, but your heals have to be within touch range, so it's going to make it way less practical to do that. So that in consequence is going to make healers even more desirable in Reaper, because party members can't heal themselves nearly as effective anymore. So demand for healers is definitely going to go way up as a result of this, because not only can other players with this toggle active not heal themselves anymore, with the added HP buff, it's going to be even harder for classes who aren't speccing in healing to fully heal other characters. So if you don't have multiple stacking devotion items on and all that stuff, you're not going to be able to insta heal people to full like a lot of characters could before. So it's going to really increase that need for healers. So another kind of negative effect of this is that gearing becomes less important. So any kind of con bonus or HP bonus through gear now becomes less important, because everyone gets this huge flat 50% bonus. So what that means is, so if you have say 3,000 HP, it makes a plus 30 HP item less of a big deal than if you had 1,500 HP or whatever. So the more HP you get in total, and the more HP you get as a result of a boost from this new toggle, just makes any flat HP bonuses you have less important. So any con boost less important in comparison. So that's the thing. It makes gearing less as important, and also tunes that don't really go for the best gear in the game aren't going to be as penalized for not having that best gear, at least when it specifically only when it comes to any kind of HP boosting type gear. So that matters. Now, obviously, there is a stacking effect to this. So the more base HP you have, the more total HP you're going to have, because this is a percentage increase, but it still matters. It still makes gearing less important, because everyone's going to have this huge flat base HP boost. So it's going to be easier to get up to an acceptable level of HP. Okay, next let's talk about power creep. So the big thing about Reaper is that the devs said when it came out that Reaper wasn't supposed to be fair, that basically wasn't supposed to be fair. It's supposed to be a challenge difficulty. But the big contradiction here is that developers are now balancing for it with this change, or is it a contradiction? So that was my concern initially, as I said before, when Reaper came out, that they're going to start normalizing it, and they're kind of doing that with this, but it's not really. It's definitely a consequence of them trying to solve a larger problem. But the thing is, they can easily fix this and still have this changed by increasing the difficulty of Reaper, which I hope they do, and they should do, because this change that is more normalizing Reaper can be counteracted by them making Reaper more difficult. So that's something they should do, and I think that's something they should have done anyways, or they should be doing. They should evaluate on a yearly basis and make Reaper more difficult, just as more and more power creep happens in the game, because with every year that goes out, we're going to see class passes, we're going to see new and better gear. So as that happens, they should be reevaluating this anyway, so they really should reevaluate Reaper to keep up with that power creep. So hopefully they do that. All right, and let's see. The other thing with the power creep, as I've sort of mentioned before, is that it makes hard and normal difficulties even easier, assuming the monster DPS isn't adjusted, and I don't expect it will be, because again, people don't really take well, as we saw with the monster champions way back in the day, is that when they make the standard difficulties harder, Players don't like that, so they aren't marketed as a challenge difficulty the way Reaper is. So I don't think they're going to adjust those difficulties in terms of like making the mob DPS even higher or anything like that. So just as a consequence, it just trivializes, I think, hard difficulty if it wasn't already just too easy for most everyone, and now it is much more so. And Elite is probably going to be much more soloable for much bigger variety of builds. I mean, Epic Elite Epic Elite Legendary Elite was already, I think, soloable for a lot of caster builds and some melees, but now it seems like it's going to be soloable for a lot of melee builds. So, that's the thing. Elite won't be probably nearly as much of a default difficulty. I think a lot more people, again, as a result of this, will be jumping more to your lower end Reapers who were running stuff like Epic Elite. And that may not necessarily be a bad thing, because it's going to affect your, power creep from Reaper side. It's going to basically shrink how spread out players are in the game. So before, like as of right now, we have a lot of players running like Hard and Elite, and a lot of other players running like Reaper 1 as their standard, and some running like Reaper 3 or 4 as their standard. But it's going to push a lot of those players out from Epic Elite and Epic Hard, or Legendary Elite, Legendary Hard, up to your lower end Reapers. So I think it's going to shrink just how much the player base is spread out in DDO right now. And you will see some of players who, as a result of this change, who maybe were running like Reaper 2 or 1, now going up to more Reaper 3 or 4. So you might say that, it's not going to spread out. It's going to stay about the same because of that, because of these Reaper 1 and 2 players moving up in difficulty as a result of this buff. But I don't think that's going to be the case, because, again, as I've said before, this change is going to affect your lower end Reapers and buff those players a lot more than, say, your players who are already running like Reaper 8, 9, 10 on melees. Because, again, the additional hits you survive as a result of this buff at the lower Reapers or like Epic Elite is going to be a lot more than the number of extra hits you'll survive on Reaper 10. So the seconds of additional survivability you gain is going to be higher on the lower difficulties as a comparison to the super high one. So it's more of a buff to your Epic Elite or Reaper 1 players. So that's why I think it'll shrink, so you'll see a lot more players in comparison go from like Epic Elite to Reaper 1. Then you will see players going from like Reaper 7 to Reaper 10, or Reaper 8 to Reaper 10. Those players who are playing that high aren't receiving nearly as big of a buff in comparison to the number of extra hits you will survive on the lower, more more standardly run difficulties like Epic Elite, Reaper 1. So that's a good thing, because as with the game shrinking, the population, I think, it's stabilized a lot, but it has shrunk. If you look at where it was like 3-4 years ago, it has shrunk a lot. So it's with more level increases that we've seen, like the cap going up to 30 a couple years ago, and everything has spread out the player base even more. So this should kind of push people more towards playing together. Obviously, this isn't going to be nearly as good as like a server merge would be, which I really hope they do, but it will help push players together and playing together more on the servers, I do think. All right, so I think we finally about reached the end of the video. So let's go to the conclusion I have from this. And there's just a lot to think about with this change, because this is, again, is such a massive change to the meta. It's huge. And overall, the change has some really good upsides. I think that shrinking the survivability difference between melee and ranged and casters is a good goal. It makes sense. It's something you see a lot in other MMO or fantasy type games with the healer, tank, caster trinity, where the casters are supposed to be more fragile. Some of the downsides, like I mentioned, lower difficulties become more invalidated. Power creep is going to hurt the effectiveness or the desirability, I think, of some content and some gear. Build diversity and playstyle diversity decreases. The thing with this change is you're now either, with this toggle on, you're now either on or off. You're either a ranged or a melee. You get to pick one. It means doing both, trying to do both, means a headache of constantly hitting toggles and dealing with HP fluctuation. So it seems to be impractical at this point to be playing with the intention of constantly toggling this ability on and off. So bottom line, it makes DDO into a more role-oriented game, which you could argue is a good thing. I'm biased because I like characters that do a variety of things, but you could argue that's a good thing. And as I've said in the past, DDO has needed, I think has gone away too much from having roles in the past. So this could be a good thing for the game overall in that regard, even though it kind of hurts me personally of the type of builds I like to run. So really the big question is, do the upsides outweigh the downsides? And after thinking a lot about it, I grudgingly say yes if a couple changes are made and if Reaper is made harder to compensate. But it's very close. I think it's it's really close on to whether this type of change should be implemented or not. And I don't feel like super great about it, but I think and I do think, again, there needs to be exceptions for builds like Eldritch Knights and Melee Divines to be able to melee and cast at the same time, at least healing spells and buffs when it comes to melee. And again, I don't think that tanking builds should lose out on this. I think it should stack with those tanking stances that I mentioned. But I grudgingly say that this is a good thing because this has been a problem for the game in a long time, that melees haven't been where casters have been in terms of effective survivability. Not just survivability in terms of the math, but actually effective survivability in terms of how many hits they can survive and how practically they're getting hit. But it's a really close call, I think, whether this is the right move. But I am leaning slightly yes, although there's some considerable downsides, and I totally understand and would respect anyone that feels this is not the right move for the game. But I think grudgingly, I say yes if they address some of the things that I've mentioned, like let the hybrid builds heal at least and buff at the same time, and don't let the tanking builds benefit. So I think if those changes are made, I'd be for it. But it's definitely close, and it's definitely going to have some ramifications, some bad ramifications as far as power creep. And that's not good. So guys, yeah, let me know what you think. Please comment below. And again, I've got the forum thread listed below under this video in the description if you want to check out the forums. And again, if you're running a barbarian, you definitely at least need to read that so you know the specific changes, which I did not mention in this video. But yeah, guys, comment below. Let me know what you think. That's going to be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you next time. Take care.